sex. Let's talk about that first, because honestly, I think that is the biggest thing, at least from a man's perspective, the biggest disagreement, the biggest thing that you have resentment towards with your spouse. Like, there's just so much that never gets said, that gets built up, and then, one spouse or another goes outside of the marriage, starts doing things, and then it's just like this big old cluster, and then the marriage explodes.
I think in our case, we didn't, and I've said this before in past podcasts we had, in our case, we didn't have a lot of trauma in that area. I know there's a lot of listeners probably out there that have had traumatic experiences in their sex life with past partners or past spouses or whatever it may be. And so I think that when you have that and you bring that trauma into a relationship, it can get messy. And so I think because we didn't have that, as I've said, I didn't have sex with anyone before Brett. And so he was my first one. Brett did, but it wasn't very many. And so I think there wasn't a lot of trauma there. And so I think that kind of helped us start us off on a simpler path towards connection. And so if you do bring that trauma into your relationship, I feel like that there is an extra step that you have to really heal through that together. So
regarding sex, it's just really expectations, right? What are my expectations for sex? What are your expectations for sex? When do we want to do it? How much do we want to do it, right? You can have a really high active sex life and be great together. You can have a really low active sex life and be great together. But you just have to identify and at least get close to the same page of what these things are. You don't have to agree every single time we're both going to want sex at the same time. That's not real life. But when I know what your sexual expectations are and you know what mine is, when we both know how to pleasure the other person, when we know what to do on period times and when the kids are young and all of that kind of stuff, right? When life gets messy and gets in the way, we have a clear understanding, and we did not at the very beginning, and we did not the first few years, honestly. Like, it was a lot of just, hey, here's an issue, let's talk through it. Here's another issue, let's talk through it. And I would encourage everyone to start there, is let's just spill the beans. What do we want for our sex lives? What does our partners want for our sex lives? What are the expectations? And we're not going to be perfect. We're not going to meet them completely, but at least start with the awareness of what your partner's sexual expectations are.
What comes with that can be an embarrassment, I think, to one or both parties, where if one person comes forward and says, I really want sex 3 to 4 times a week, and the other person responds in like a shocked face and is like, well, I only want sex 1 time a week. It kind of makes them feel in a way like less than, like, oh, I want it too much or I don't want it enough. And so I think that this is again where the communication comes into play. Like, okay, well, is there a reason why you want it 3 or 4 times a week? You can answer that. Yes, I'm a man. I have, it's built up in me and I need to get it out. And so I think it's because Brett has communicated to me in a way that I understand why he wants it that way. It's not because he's super horny all the time. It's just like wants it all the time. No, I think there's the genetic reason behind it that was explained to me in a way that was like, oh, well, that makes sense. Okay, then I understand why you need it 3 to 4 times a week. So I think it's more of just communicating your needs and why those are your needs.
To kind of couple on to that, I think this topic can get a little messy, but it's really important to really just talk through all these kind of things. But there's porn that goes into these kind of things. There's masturbation. There's looking at the opposite spouse or sex outside of the relationship. All of these kind of things you can set boundaries on. You're not going to be perfect, right? No one's perfect, but at least here's what the expectations are. And especially with like porn and things like that, it gets real sticky if one person thinks, hey, it's okay and I'm going to do this and this is what I've always done prior to getting together, and the other person's like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe you would do something like that. We are married now and that's something that can't happen. Like, you've broken my trust. There's so many different things that people see this on, and it's honestly a hard conversation, but it's a very necessary conversation for the longevity of your marriage.
We've had the conversations many times, like Brett said, and I literally don't even think I could look him in the eye when we first had the conversations. I literally would look somewhere else because I was so embarrassed. Like I didn't want to look him in the eye. But we still talked about it, right? Like we still got it out. We still talked about it. So I think that there's this expectation of this conversation is going to be perfect. The words are going to flow and everything. It's not. It's going to be super uncomfortable. You're going to fumble over your words. Sometimes you're not going to know how to effectively communicate your feelings, and that's okay. I think that this is your partner. This is like the person you're doing life with. This is the person that you trust, and I think that your vulnerability is important during this conversation. It's important to be vulnerable. It's important to be open. It's important to not really care if you stumble over your words and be like, oh, wait, I didn't mean it that way. Hold on, let me say it a different way. That's okay. I think it's good to know that it's not going to be a perfect conversation.
They are not perfect conversations. I can think back on a bunch of them where you're crying and I'm yelling, and it's just like, oh my gosh, this did not go very smooth.
It's never the opposite. I'm never yelling and you're never crying. So
it happens. Yeah. So I would just say that, you know what, it's not easy, and life is not supposed to be easy, but it is such an important thing to do, to get out and just set a time, set a space to be like, babe, let's talk about sex. Let's just sit down when there's no kids around, when there's no distractions, turn off our phones, put it in airplane mode, and just be like, just sit in this and just do it. Mm-hmm.